This room is turning into an emergent model of the psyche. We're just expanding in all directions. We have alternate models of furniture over here. This is very fitting for today's conversation. Let's go ahead and get started. Thanks so much, everybody, for being here. It's wonderful to see so many friends in person, many of whom we have not seen one another in years. But mostly, I'm seeing some new faces, so new friends. So thanks, everybody. There's some fierce competition at 2 o'clock today, so I'm grateful for all of you that showed up. I'd like to begin with, you could call it a reflection, a meditation, if you're comfortable with that language. I just want to invite you to take a moment to close your eyes. And let's take a few deep breaths together as a group. So inhaling and out through the mouth. And let's do that 2 more times together. Inhaling. And one more time. Yeah. I think following the breath is a really powerful way to attune as a group, as well as to transition. Those of you that are students or former students or faculty at Pacifica know that the 2 o'clock hour is the difficult time to teach a 6.5-hour class. Everyone's coming back from lunch, and the body's wanting to slow down, and yet the mind is wanting to speed up, and it's usually the body that wins. So I'd like to, now that we're sort of together and transition and landed here, I'd like to invite you into another more imaginal, reflective activity. The land that we are on is a palimpsest. Is that a word people are familiar with? A palimpsest? It's an art historian word for a canvas that has multiple paintings on top of it. So art historians will sometimes do like artistic archaeology, and they'll remove a layer of a painting only to find that the canvas had been used multiple times. This is particularly something that people did in the ancient world when papyri, when manuscripts were very rare, or in the medieval world with vellum. It was very difficult and took a long time to make, so they reuse it. This land is like that. Our country is like that. Our planet is like that. So I want to take a moment to do sort of a reverse chronology acknowledgement of the spirits and the ancestors of this space, who I really believe are still with us. And in our most recent history, we have the folks who were involved with the founding of the school. We have the faculty that have dedicated their lives and their energy to creating and building this space. We have the Roman Catholic Jesuit order, who once resided here full time. I think that their energy and their spirit and their commitment to their spiritual practice is still present here. And then when we dial back, a few hundred years, we have the Chumash people, who I very much believe their spirit and their ancestry is still present in this land. But then there's also the personal histories and the genealogies, the ghosts that we all carry with us. And that's also who I particularly want to honor, because I believe those folks, for better or for worse, follow us around wherever we go. So that each one of you has a sort of invisible family tree hovering around this room. So just take a moment to honor and acknowledge one particular person from your own ancestral lineage. Maybe it was somebody that helped you get to this moment. Maybe it was somebody who tried to prevent you from getting to this moment. Just see who shows up. And if it feels right, just give them a bow. Just an acknowledgement. And if and only if it truly feels right, maybe a thank you. Thank you. Okay, so thank you again for being here today. You know, we're going to hang out with the dead. I mean, that's what you showed up for. I mean, we're going to hang out with the ancestors, not just the ancestors of our depth psychological tradition, but the ancestors that we carry with us. And we're going to do some work with them in probably a secondary way. It's not going to be direct, but they're here. And I think it's important to recognize that they are here and they're always here. Right? So the presentation is about an hour, maybe a little bit more, depending on how carried away I get, but I do want to make time for conversation and discussion and hear from you. There is a handout. I really try to not do paper anymore. So if you have a device and you're familiar with academia.edu, you could either do that now or you could do that later, but there's a handout on my academia.edu page, which is David Odoricio. And it's if you scroll down to the bottom, it's called The Occult Origins of Depth Psychology. But you don't need to worry about that now. You can do it later. Okay, so for this next hour or so, we are going to enter one particular portal to the imaginal. And this is through the lens and the historical trajectory of spiritualism, which was certainly an American, but also a transatlantic phenomenon. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Right. So after just a brief gloss on the history of spiritualism and its American and very, very local roots, we're then going to turn to some of the psychologist philosophers who theorized these mediums, most of whom were women and most of whom were males that were theorizing them. So it's a male medical model of a mostly female phenomenon. So there's a feminist and a gendered component to this as well. And then we'll turn specifically to what I'm calling the occult origins of depth psychology, specifically through the Jung in his own words, through his memoir, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, and then through his red book. Okay, so that's just sort of the overview. And let me begin here then with a quote. This is from William Rowlandson and his recent book, Imaginal Landscapes, which is a very thin, very fun read. I love how he breaks this down. Mediumship is communication with spirits. We are all spirits. We communicate. It's like an if, then, therefore logic thing, you know? We are all, in a sense, then, mediums, which I think is true. We are acting as mediums. We are receiving, we are receptive, we are communicating, we are transmitting constantly throughout the day, biologically, energetically, verbally. We are constantly creatures that communicate. We are mediums. Right? So we are all, in a sense, participating in this very, sometimes bizarre, occult historical trend. Right? We're part of it. So again, this is just an overview of what I laid out here. We have about three theatrical movements for the next hour. So to dive right in to the occult, the origins of the occult in American metaphysical religion. Okay, so we're going to start by looking at the 19th century movement of spiritualism. These are, in a sense, the indirect/direct roots of the origins of depth psychology. Because as we know, for those of us that are interested in reception history, there's texts, figures, humans are received in different ways. Their stories are told in certain ways. So we have sort of the popular Jung, the received Jung, and then we have the occult Jung. Occult, which means, by definition, hidden, secret. Okay? So we're looking more at the peeking the curtain back to the hidden or the understory of the backgrounds of Jungian and depth psychology, which is more well known today, but still somewhat unspoken. So spiritualism, or the religious movement that became known as spiritualism, is typically traced by historians to the year 1848 in upstate New York, in Hydesville, in what became known as the Burned Over District, because of the revival, the religious revival that was happening in the middle of the 20th century in that region. The Church of Latter-day Saints, Joseph Smith, the Mormons, that was part of it, the Shakers. There was so much religious happening in that particular part of New York that it's almost as if upstate New York was, in a certain sense, haunted, or at least that the earth was somehow shaking underneath them, and people were somehow manifesting these energetic currents of the spirit, because it was happening in so many different ways in the mid-century. So two sisters in particular, Kate and Margaret Fox, began to communicate with what they claimed was a poltergeist in their home. They used a version of Morse code that they called alphabet raps, 1 for A, 2 for B, and so on. They taught their ghost how to communicate with them. Right? So they would communicate with the ghost and question the ghost about the circumstances of his own death. Right? So this is a form of imaginal world. This is a portal to the imaginal. Right? And we will see, you're probably already ahead of me at this time, you can see how this is an early aspect of communicating with the unconscious. Right? So Kate and Margaret's older sister, Leah, they began arranging public displays of their newfound abilities. However, just to cut to the chase, many decades later, they self-exposed themselves as fraudulent, admitting that their ghostly rappings were nothing more than their very own and very loud knuckle cracking, fingers and toes, which were so loud that they could make it seem almost like they were echoing or throwing their voice, so to speak. So the truth of this aside, a new religious movement was born with very, very specific and I think important socio-cultural as well as religious implications. So what's the socio-cultural context? Spiritualism has been interpreted as a kind of popular form of grief counseling. Now, the Civil War ran from, officially ended in 1865. It's difficult for us to imagine, maybe not in the current global situation, but these were the children, right? These were the children of rural folks who were sending their sons to battle, oftentimes against their own cousins or whoever happened to be north or south of the Mason-Dixon line. So the amount of the reality of the dead and the fact of what warfare looked like at that time, where people actually were seeing the people that they were engaged in battle with, death was a reality in a very palpable, material, embodied sense that is not so much today with modern warfare, which has become so much more electronic and almost theoretical and numerical. But there was a time when it was very real, very local on our soil. It was the first time Americans were fighting against themselves. So the idea of spiritualism, communicating with the dead, emerging out of a post-Civil War environment makes sense. However, it doesn't mean that that's all it was, right? I'm not trying to do like a sociological nothing but reductionism sort of thing here, okay? I think it's helpful though, contextually. The other thing is the high infant mortality rates of that time. So it was a culture that was much more in touch with the realities of human loss and finding a way to, in a pre-psychoanalytic era, communicate, right? To mourn, to grieve, what psychoanalytic historians have referred to as the ability, or Freud referred to as the ability to mourn. The other piece is the religious piece, the religious context, which spiritualism can be interpreted as a form of a post-Christian Protestantism. What does that mean? Mid 20th century is very similar to where we are today with something like the rise of the spiritual but not religious movement, where folks are finding institutional, traditional religions insufficient to meet their personal spiritual needs. So oftentimes people turn to what? It's a return to personal, individual spiritual experience. Spiritualism was not a church. It was a church for the unchurched. It was more of a circle of believers rather than a creed or a doctrine or a dogma or a ritual or a liturgy. It was an individual belief system that a community formed around, sort of similar to the early Jungian circles or the Jungian community. Right? So a post-Christian form of Protestantism in the sense that spiritualism emerged out of Protestant soil. But what's fascinating is the extent and how rapid the growth of spiritualism was across the ocean to England and to France. And then once it started to commingle with theosophy and the rapidly emerging European fascination with all things exotic, mystical, and Eastern, we sort of had a full-blown occult explosion. Not that different than what we've seen at the turn of this past century. Okay. So the emphasis from the very beginning was on multiplicity, or what the early theorists referred to as secondary selves. Right? These types of we'll just call them supernormal powers or abilities consisted of things like somnambulism, forms of sleepwalking, or parts of the body that would go into a trance or be asleep and then would channel a voice and then do automatic writing, things like that. Trance states, mediumship, hallucinations, past life explorations, as well as auditory and visionary experience. It was the whole gamut of what today sort of gets roped into the oftentimes derogatory notion of a new age. It was a 19th century sort of new age revival. You could look at it in that sense. Right? So I don't want to do. We got to do a historical foundation here, but I want to move beyond that. And then get a little bit local, and then we'll get a little bit more current to the depth psychological situation. So August of 2018, the Santa Barbara Independent runs a headline, "The Talking Dead, Spiritualism in Summerland and Beyond." Summerland, right down the hill. This is our most immediate local ancestral community. We're talking about the ancestors here. This is an image of what Summerland looked like in 1885. Summerland was founded as a spiritualist community. Many folks don't know that. Before it became an oil town, the land was donated and founded to be a community for spiritualists and mediums. The owner of the land then discovered that it was very rich with oil. The Santa Barbara Channel is one of the richest oil fields, I think, in North America. So very quickly, it went from spiritualism to oil economy. But these were the origins. Like the origins of this area was, as you will see in a moment, attempting to communicate with imaginal worlds. How fitting that we would find ourselves with two campuses right in the immediate vicinity. Right? Okay. So here are just some images, just to sort of set the Victorian tone. Examples of early popular occulture, table turning, the planchette, which was an early form of the Ouija board, and then an image here of a gentleman doing some automatic writing experiments where you can see how he's being both influenced by his good and bad angel. There on the right. And you can see, because you're all depth psychologists in the room, you can totally see where we're going. So what do the equally emergent trend of the now what we call the modern discipline of psychology, where does that come in? Well, it starts with William James and Frederick Myers and folks on the other side of the pond, the British Society for Psychical Research. And for them, spiritualism and the phenomenon of mediumship, just like Jung later in his career was using comparative religion as evidence for his theory of individuation, this early group of psychologists, philosophers was using spiritualism and experiments with mediums and seances as what they felt was historical material evidence for the realities of what has not yet been called the unconscious, but it's what we're moving towards. At that time, the phrase that was being used by the British and American Society for Psychical Research, William James, Frederick Myers, was the subliminal. the subliminal, below the threshold of consciousness. So the subliminal was one of the earliest terms for what later won out was the term the unconscious. And this is a famous quote from Frederick Myers. I accord no primacy to my ordinary waking self. That would be sort of our empirical ego consciousness. Except that among my potential selves, this one has shown itself fittest to meet the needs of a common life. This is very, very similar to what William James would then reframe in 1902 in one of the most famous passages from the Varieties of Religious Experience, where he makes this distinction between our normal waking consciousness, rational consciousness, what we would later refer to as the ego, perhaps, one special type of consciousness. While all about it, parted from it by the filmiest of screens, they're like potential forms of consciousness entirely different. How to regard them is the question. And I love William James, his openness here. He's not trying to be a reductive scientific materialist. He's actually reacting against that trend in the 19th century. And he is entirely open to what he referred to as the more, which were these supernormal or superhuman aspects or types of consciousness. This openness to multiplicity, this openness to consciousness beyond rationality. Our rational consciousness is only one aspect of our ordinary waking selves. It might tie our shoes or help us get dressed in the morning, but it's not what designs the shoes or the technologies that even designed the types of clothing that we wear. There are other types of consciousnesses, I will argue in a minute, imaginal types of consciousness, right, that are actually world constructing, world creating, but also the types of the aspects of self that might potentially be able to communicate with other worlds, right? And we will get there shortly. Okay, so just some other examples. This early trend certainly went well beyond Myers and James. There were a number of European as well as American psychologists who were doing their own mediumship research. So Morton Prince, who was a Boston-based psychiatrist, very influential in early study on dissociation and mediumship. We have Theodore Flournoy with Helene Smith. His From India to the Planet Mars was a study of her multiple imaginal worlds, including that she claimed to channel different languages. Martian, she had these really wild past life experiences as an Indian princess. And Flournoy was documenting all of these. And of course, Flournoy was very influential on Jung. And Jung, as we will get to in depth momentarily, his dissertation on the psychology and pathology of so-called occult phenomenon, he did not fill out any research forms with the Board of Behavioral Sciences when he chose his cousin, Heli Priestwork, as the subject of his dissertation and his own family seances. So we'll dive into that further in a minute. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, there's a very gendered component here because we have scientific male, what was becoming a scientific male medical establishment loosely, and then the reality that 9 out of 10 of these mediums were women. So what you see when you start to look at the literature from that time is that these early descriptions or definitions of the subliminal, of the psyche, of the unconscious, they sound a lot like stereotypical characterizations of women or woman at the turn of the century. So all of a sudden, the unconscious sounds a lot like these types of Victorian stereotypes. Women are pliable, they are malleable, they are multiple. So there becomes a conflation between woman and psyche. And Jung obviously picks up on this much earlier, but you see this with the male medical model that's beginning to be established here. And there's a lot of literature, critiquing the early Freudian model, and this is pre-discovery of transference and all. There's a whole sort of level of psychoanalytic engagement here, plus the fact that many of these male psychiatrists or psychologists had decades-long relationships with these women, whether they were related to them or not. The realities of the transference were very, very strong, and it's something that was not bracketed out in their research. So it's important to own that. There's also a very interesting post-colonial critique, because when you look at the research of a lot of the mediums and the seances, some of the ghosts and spirits that emerge through seances are oftentimes Native American spirit guides. So there's a caricature that's happening of American others, right? Whether it's women or whether it's indigenous folks, there's a certain othering that's happening through the art and practice of mediumship, right? So that's an important piece there as well. And here are some two of the more influential, infamous mediums: Eusapia Palladino, who was an Italian medium who was heavily studied by the British Society for Psychical Research, and Leonora Piper. That was William James' White Crow. He believed that she was the one case out of 100 that proved the reality of mediumship, and again, James had a decades-long working relationship with her as well. The other piece that I've been doing a lot of critique, but the other piece that's important, Anne Broad's very influential work, she actually interprets this as a means of empowerment for women, because mediumship, just like medieval women's religious experience or visionary monastic women in the Middle Ages, and their use of prophecy or prophetic voice, it was a way for women to have a voice in a culture that didn't provide one for them. So that's the other more constructive piece around spiritualism and the gendered piece, because this was also around the time of the suffragette movement. So it was a way for women to speak, but oftentimes they had to perform their speech through other voices, right? So that's really important. Okay, so this brings us to one of the earliest psychological theories, highly influential in the work of Jung, as well as today in contemporary trauma studies, and that is this concept of dissociation. Now, dissociation can be framed in two different ways for these early emerging models of the psyche. One is we could refer to as a holistic or a pathological model. Now, what does that mean? That doesn't mean holistic in the way that we think of it today, where it's like mind, body, spirit. Holistic is a term that could be used to describe the work of people like Charcot, Pierre Genet, Breuer, and Freud, where any sort of aberration, any sort of splitting in the psyche is seen as something that is pathological. So the model is holistic. The aim for psychotherapy is to create a strong, sort of singular ego. It's almost sort of like a monotheistic psychology, to borrow from James Hillman. Right? So anything that has any sense of multiplicity or fragmentation or splitting is considered pathological. Right? An alternative model that develops through Myers and James, and their sort of more, let's just call it pluralistic openness, is what Myers coined as the multiplex mind. That is one of my favorite. I think we should reframe the unconscious as the multiplex mind. So this notion of multiplicity, that the understanding is that the unconscious, the mind, the psyche is inherently multiple. And this doesn't just mean two, it means two or more, right? This is obviously more in alignment with something like James Hillman's polytheistic revisioning of psychology, only about 100 or so years earlier. And this was really the work of Myers and James. How do we reframe our understanding of psychology? And for James, it extended to cosmology from the perspective of plural. And one of James's most famous last works was entitled A Pluralistic Universe. He was very much pointing towards plurality, sort of towards pluralism. Okay, this is very important, and we will come back to this, right? So the multiplex model makes room for splitting. Right? It makes room for, well, as we will see, the imaginal. Now, we have a whole conference around the imaginal. We have a whole institute that orients around the imaginal. Where does this idea come from? What would we consider as a genealogy of the imaginal or imaginal experience? This is another, Myers was a big term coiner. So this goes back to Myers, only he used it in a little bit of a different way. So Frederick Myers used the word imaginal in this sort of evolutionary capacity. So if you look at the different stages of an insect's metamorphosis from its cocoon until its final birth as a butterfly, the final adult form of the metamorphosis, Myers referred to as the imaginal. So there's something ripe, there's something pregnant about his use of the imaginal. right? But that's very different than the idea that we've inherited today, which comes more through the work of Henri Corbin. Many of you who have read James Hillman probably know Henri Corbin and his famous work on the imaginal and creative imagination in the 12th century Sufi Ibn Arabi. Corbin defined the imaginal as a noetic organ. So noetic, there's a gnosis, right? There's an alternate kind of knowing. A noetic organ that accesses a real dimension of reality, the intermediate world of the mundus imaginalis. Now we're getting closer to sort of the Pacifica ethos here. All right. For Corbin, the imaginal world is the place where myth and symbol happen. Right? So the imaginal is a mediating reality between sort of the earthly material and whatever else the more is, whatever kinds of, as we'll see in a minute with Ibn Arabi, who understood the mundus imaginalis as the mediating world between the human and the angelic, or the divine. And then, of course, we have to give the nod to Hillman as well, who constructed an entire psychological cosmology around this notion of the imaginal, or the mythopoetic. Okay, so Jeffrey Kripal, who's a contemporary scholar, historian of religions, focuses on comparative mysticism. He breaks the imaginal down into two different concepts, what he calls the symbolic imaginal and the empirical imaginal. Right? Now, what are these? These are some fancy $5 academic ideas. So what does this mean? The symbolic imaginal mediates, right? We're mediating through symbols. He refers to as a cipher, something that requires interpretation. It's dream analysis. It's Jung's idea of a big dream. Right? I think this is the realm that most of us, at least Pacifica folks that have fully drank the Kool-Aid, we're drinking the symbolic imaginal. Like that's the good stuff. Like that's the juicy therapy stuff where it's like, okay, we're in the personal unconscious, and then finally you get that juicy imaginal dream, the big dream that shifts the therapy or shifts the life. You have the big dream, you finally make the application, you come to Pacifica. It's like the big dream is the stuff that like we're all sort of waiting for, right? It's like we're fishing in the pond of our own personal muck all day until finally the big one comes up. I think the symbolic imaginal is what most people mean when they talk about the imaginal. Right? But the other piece here that Kripal refers to is the empirical imaginal. And for him, the empirical imaginal is the kind of material historical realism that we see, for example, in seance phenomenons when mediums produce ectoplasm out of their mouths or potentially their female genitalia, or wherever the ectoplasm wants to emerge from. That's the kind of material historical realism that he means. Thank you for laughing. That's the kind of material historical realism that he's interested in. Kripal is interested in the reality of things like precognition, telepathy, clairvoyance, ESP, the things that mediums were claiming to be able to produce, right? So he combines that into this definition of the imaginal because for Kripal, his bigger project is to bring these things back onto the table to push back against the kind of scientific and academic materialism that has grown especially rampant in the humanities. So Kripal wants to take these types of things seriously as well. Okay, so how does this happen? How do we what is the portal? What is the portal to the imaginal? I keep getting these images from like Super Mario Brothers when you like go down into the pipe, into the underworld. Like what is the portal to the imaginal? So for Kripal, he came up with this phrase that he refers to as the empowered imagination. So the imagination has to become empowered in order to enter into the imaginal. And he defines this as special moments when the imagination is electrified, zapped, or magnetized, and it just knows. What is known or seen in such special states remains imagined, so you're still using your imagination, right? But it is now experienced as somehow more real and more true. The empowered religious imagination is no longer simply constructing and projecting, right? So that's the personal unconscious, or just sort of like cognitive analytical thinking. It is now also mediating and translating. So this is the symbolic imaginal. It's like a download. Think about it like religious form of revelation. And in some quite extraordinary cases, like mediumship or in a seance that's going very well, they might even manifest as some sort of empirical reality. Does that make sense? The distinction between these two? Okay. So he summarizes, something is coming through, and this something is both real and imagined, right? It's both. It's a liminal space. The imaginal is an in-between realm, right? And for those of you, just to do some comparative religious studies stuff here, those of you that are familiar with something like Tibetan Buddhism and deity yoga practices, also known as creation stage practices in Vajrayana Buddhism, where deities are very, very intentionally, specifically, and with an intense amount of focus, imaginatively constructed in using the imagination until the practitioner identifies and becomes the deity. So there's a flip. There's a moment where you are doing an active construction using your imagination, but then there's a moment when you actually become the deity, and you are no longer you. You are the deity, right? You are something more. That's the process of empowerment. That's entering into the imaginal from the space of this empowered imaginal. The imaginal cosmology of somebody like Ibn Arabi is another, from the 12th century Sufi context, is another comparative analog or example here, right? Where the imaginal is a realm that mediates. It's the realm of revelation. It's where the divine downloads come from and how they come through, right? Whether it's something like the revelation of Muhammad or the revelation of some sort of spiritual or mystical text. It happens through the imaginal. They come through the portal to the imaginal, right? Through the angel, through the voice of the angel. So again, to go back to Kripal, how does this happen? Well, we have to return to the notion of dissociation and the reality of trauma. Because for Kripal, trauma is one of the portals to the imaginal. So again, to cite him, trauma, it seems, is what electrifies, zaps, or magnetizes, and hence empowers the imagination. So the reality of trauma, whether it's physical, whether it's sexual, these are moments of dissociation that are oftentimes learned in childhood or learned unwillingly or unwittingly, that sometimes produce certain results in folks later in life. Like many of you that know the work of Don Kalshed, his book Trauma and the Soul is all about this phenomenon. Sometimes dissociation, dissociation is a survival technique that can be helpful in many ways, but it also can be a way that opens us up if we can learn how to consciously cultivate practices of dissociation like they do in certain yoga traditions that open us up to these other realms. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. And just two more examples here. Jess Hollenbach, who's another religious studies scholar, he does some work with this idea of empowerment as well, and he references the work of Black Elk and the visionary experiences of Black Elk. Teresa of Avila as well as another example. But in the history of religions, these types of experiences have often been kept off the table. That's a phrase that Kripal uses a lot. Religious studies, particularly in the European and American context, wants to focus on texts and textual analysis and go back to parsing of words and philological analysis. But Kripal is saying, what about the empowered experiences that lay behind the creation of these texts in the first place? Right? So how do we put these types of anomalous experiences back on the table, and how do we take seriously these experiences of these women? Okay. Shifting, moving along. Is too fast? Okay. One of my favorite quotes from Jung is in his 1925 seminar where he's introducing his notion of Jungian, what becomes Jungian psychology. And he describes his Red Book experience as being in analysis with a ghost and a woman. Now, I've been trying to figure out who is who. Because the ghost and the woman could be Philemon and Salome. But the more I think about it, I wonder if the ghost is potentially Philemon or Salome, and I wonder if the woman is actually Toni Wolff. That's really what I'm wondering. So I love that quote, and I want to use that to introduce this next piece as we shift to looking specifically at the paranormal in the life and writings of Jung. So it's important that we're standing, so we talked earlier about the family tree and the lineage and the genealogies that we carry with us. It's important to note that we are standing in Jung's matrilineage. This is his mother's side of the family tree. His father, as you probably know, was a pastor, a Swiss Reformed pastor. So that's sort of like the Protestant theological, that's the official Christian side. That's the Protestant side of Jung's family. But when we look at his mother's side, there's a very, very freaky paranormal family tree. His maternal grandfather, Samuel Priestwerk, believed himself to be continually surrounded by ghosts, kept a special chair in his study for his deceased first wife, with whom he would regularly communicate with. His second wife, Augusta, Jung's grandmother, was thought to be clairvoyant. And their daughter, Jung's mother, kept a diary exclusively for her strange occurrences. And this is from Roderick Mayne, some of you might know. And this is from Jung himself. So this is Jung describing these types of strange occurrences. This is from Memories, Dreams, Reflections. This is him describing what we could maybe consider, I don't know if it's a typical night in the Jung household. But even if it's not, even if this happened once in a child's lifetime, it's enough for therapy for the rest of one's life. And you're going to see why in a second. You're probably already familiar with this, but this is one of the wildest passages in MDR, Memories, Dreams, Reflections. Okay, nighttime in the Jung household. The nocturnal atmosphere had begun to thicken. By the way, this is almost identical to the language that Jung will use later to describe his 7 sermons to the dead. So we'll get there later, but very similar language. The nocturnal atmosphere had begun to thicken. All sorts of things were happening at night, incomprehensible, alarming. This is very important. My parents were sleeping apart, so something's happening in the household. Right? He's sleeping in his father's room. From his mother's room came frightening influences. At night, mother was strange and mysterious. It's hard to read this out loud, not because it's humorous, but because it's traumatic. One night, I saw coming from her door a faintly luminous, indefinite figure whose head detached itself from the neck and floated along in front of it, in the air like a little moon. He, as a child, witnessed the poltergeist phenomenon. Immediately, another head was produced, and again, it detached itself. The process was repeated 6 or 7 times. Okay, you're a child in the hallway. A ghost comes out of your mother's bedroom. Its head detaches. Another one pops up. I just get this image of it sort of like moving down the hallway, doing this sort of thing. And you're just a 6-year-old or something, and you're just like, what do you do? Where's the containment for the child? Right? Very interesting, the language again. The head detached itself. I mean, this is dissociative. This is the definition of dissociative. Not only are we working with a ghost, it's a ghost whose head detaches from its body. It's like a double dissociative effect. And again, the language of the moon. I saw a glowing blue circle about the size of a full moon. Inside it moved golden figures, which I thought were angels. The vision was repeated, and each time it allayed my fear of suffocation. So the containment that Jung's not experiencing with his primary caregivers, this is Don Kalshed 101. He's receiving it through the imaginal. Right? He's receiving caregiving through these imaginal archetypal figures that become his good angels. until later, because those of you that know the full story, he has some dreams that the other side, the darker side through his dream, for example, of the phallus as a man-eater. There's the other side, the darker side of the archetypal, that's of course part of this as well. Okay. So Jung's father dies when Jung's doing his graduate studies or thereabout, and this is the time when we hear these are stories that I think more people are aware of. The freaky stuff continues to happen, only now it's more in the material, sort of historical realm, to use Kripal's material, realistic realm, to use Kripal's empirical imaginal frame. So there's this walnut table that's in their kitchen. The walnut table cracks. It's very old. There's no reason it should have cracked. Right? So there's these sort of things happening in the house. There's a knife that fractures and fragments in a way that no knife should ever break. Like it fractured into multiple pieces. And then, of course, the seances. Right? So his family's regularly conducting seances with his cousin. And those of you that have read Memories, Dreams, Reflections, you're aware of Jung's notion of his number one and number two personality. It's interesting how he also transposes that onto his mother, describing his mother as having a number one and a number two personality. And this is one of my favorite summaries of Jung and the Occult of all time from Francis Charet's book. The seances were conducted in Jung's own home. The medium was his cousin, and the participants members of his own family. In addition, a number of the spirits with which the medium was allegedly in communication were none other than Jung's ancestors. So it's a form of, this is family systems therapy. That's the seance. They're doing family systems with their ancestors through this imaginal medium who happens to be the cousin, who is young. We'll get to her in just a minute. She was about 15 or 16 years old. So following the sort of feminist gendered model we looked at earlier, is this a way of her to sort of speak the unspeakable? Is this a way for her to reveal the family secrets in a public setting, but also to personify through the voices of these other ancestors, oftentimes who were Jung's grandparents? All right, so it is a way, I think, of doing family therapy through the seance. Okay, so let's talk about Helle. Here she is, Helene. Jung refers to her as SW in his dissertation to attempt to mask her true identity. So she becomes a dressmaker. She died very tragically young. She was 29 when she died of tuberculosis. And in his dissertation, Jung says that there were 7 seances from 1899 to 1900. That was a fabrication. Sonu Shamdasani did some additional investigating, and he claims that the seances started as early as 1895, which then, we don't really know. She might have been 15 then, or 15 and 18. We don't know. So Jung had some fun with the facts in his dissertation. So this other piece about channeling, so he's channeling the voices, or she's channeling the voices of their grandparents. So Samuel Priestwork, who we saw earlier, as well as Carl Jung Sr. Helle is channeling communication around family births from other family members that live in South America or live in other parts of the world, as well as deaths in the family, past life phenomenon, and then these talk about transference, these very complex enactments of family romances that Jung ultimately realized that she was in love with him. His cousin Helle was in love with Jung. So shortly thereafter, Jung breaks off the seances, and then he does what, old school, good old boy man would do. He uses her to theorize and write his dissertation and get his acclaim and medical fame, and she has an unfortunately tragic life. So there's more that we can say, but I mean, for the sake of time, we could come back to some of this stuff later. But there's a lot here, and I want to get into some of the other material. Here's an image. First off, there's got to be at least one Freudian in the room. Here's Jung's dissertation. addressed to his mother, inscribed, you know, with love. Yeah. There is an image of a broken knife, so you can see the knife was saved. You can see how it was broken. Like, no knife should ever really break like that. It'd be very, very difficult. And then the thing with the table that's so wild is that table, that old walnut table that cracked, it was the same table that Jung and his mother and Helle and others were experimenting with doing table turning. So it's not just like it was their, you know, it might have been the table where they had breakfast, but there's also like a deeper sort of like connection there to the spiritualist stuff, right? This is an image from Jung's dissertation, from his manuscript. This is, she didn't call it this, but Jung later called it, this is the mandala. So part of the communications that Helle was receiving was this really complicated cosmology that was very almost Gnostic, very influenced by the Theosophical movement. And if you've ever read like Madame Blavatsky, very, very similar, like this sort of dense esoteric cosmology with all of these different world principles and energies and elements and planets and trying to sort of bring it all together. Well, that's what Helle was channeling through the seances. So you can see that there's these different sort of forces and energies, there's matter, there's all these different names for different types of matter and elements in this like very complicated cosmology. We can come back to this if you want, but it's basically a Gnostic cosmology where there's these powers that are both light and dark, and how they sort of move out with decreasing intensity as matter moves out into the material universe. I mean, it's very similar to what Jung comes up with in his Red Book in 1916. Very similar when Jung comes up with his own Gnostic cosmology that he refers to as the Systema Mundi Totius. And then, of course, we know later he would compose his own mandalas in the Red Book, in the Liber Novus. Now, I'm not trying to like knock or critique Jung's originality, but we do know that Jung was not always one to give credit where credit was due, particularly with the theories of somebody like Tony Wolff. So there is this marginalized lineage, mostly around the women in Jung's life, and particularly his cousin, that I think it's important to reclaim these marginalized voices and to own their potential influence in his work. Okay, and then the paranormal, of course, was a key part of the break between Freud and Jung. So this is in Vienna in 1909, and for those of you that saw the movie Dangerous Method, it's dramatized there. But you know, this is the famous, you know, Freud and Jung are sort of up all night and they're meeting and they're getting real intense about their ideas, and then Jung has this sensation as if his diaphragm was made of iron and was becoming red hot. And then all of a sudden there's this loud crack in the bookcase. And, you know, Jung is an intuitive type. You know, he's trying to like figure this out, and he calls it a catalytic exteriorization phenomenon, which is, I mean, that's pretty much what Kreipel is referring to as this sort of material imaginal. And then like Freud is like, oh, come on, you know, you're crazy. And then Jung says, no, it's going to happen again. Like, this is Jung's intuition. It's going to happen. And then again, of course, it happens. I think this was really the beginning of what leads to their break over these types of experiences. And of course, Freud holding on to the sexual origination theory, and Jung moving beyond that. So this takes us finally, thank you for your patience, into Jung's Red Book years. And Joe did a bit of this tracing this morning. So the key dates of Jung's Red Book experience, he worked on it from 1912 to 1928. 16 years he worked on that. Now, it wasn't all the visionary component, the confrontation with the unconscious period, which was the most intense period, which included his visions of Europe and the rivers of blood, the flood in Europe that he thought presaged the outbreak of World War I. That was a much more abbreviated period, but the whole Red Book period was very extended, and a lot of that was when he actually did the illumination, did the artwork, and did the transcribing. So he went over it over and over and over again. The key figures are, of course, Elijah, who transforms into Philemon, and Salome, who transforms into this figure that is at times a serpent and and always his soul, but appears in always as a woman and always multiple. His soul is always multiple in the Red Book. Philemon is pretty constant as sort of like the wise old man, but his soul is always this shape-changing multiple, whether it's a serpent or a dove or appears, as Salome. So what ends up happening in the Red Book? All right, and this is going to lead us to his famous 7 Sermons of the Dead and bring us back to where we started. Okay, so in the scrutiny section, and this is deep into the Red Book at this time, Philemon says, draw near, enter into the grave of God. The place of your work should be in the vault. The God should not live in you, but you should live in the God. Right? Very powerful. It's that sort of deeper, numinous wisdom voice of Philemon. And then Jung says, 3 shades, so 3 ghosts, 3 spirits approach him. I notice from their chilly breath that they are dead. The first figure was that of a woman. And who does he identify this woman as? Hecate, goddess of the dead. Or Brimo. Brimo was another name for Hecate. So Brimo says, become a shadow and you will grasp what we give. Your heart belongs to us. So it's an invitation to do some sort of ancestral healing. And then Brimo calls the wider ancestors. You dead, I call you. Let the dead ones speak, or let the dark ones speak. And then Jung responds, I said to the dark ones, so speak, you dead. And immediately they cried in many voices. We have come back from Jerusalem, where we did not find what we sought. We implore you to let us in. You have what we desire, not your blood, but your light. That is it. And then Philemon lifted his voice and taught them, and this is the first sermon to the dead. And this is a major shift in the Red Book, because all of a sudden we get from Jung having these imaginal dialogues with all these different figures and Egyptian, the whole Egyptian thing that Joe outlined this morning, and then it sort of starts to crystallize. And from this moment, we sort of leave all this religious, therapeutic psychology that Jung is doing with comparative myth, and he moves into this very crystallized Gnostic cosmology. And that's really the birth of analytical psychology, which goes back to the image of the Systema Mundus Totius. Right? All of this comes from the voices of the dead. Right? So who are the dead? Right? Who are the dead? They're Christians. They had come back from Jerusalem. They didn't find what they were looking for. Jerusalem was the major pilgrim point. So these are pilgrims that had gone seeking some sort of truth. They didn't find what they were looking for. Christianity was no longer working for them. They needed to find something beyond the outdated or the unevolved God image. This is Jung's cosmology that he offers as what Edward Edinger would later call the new dispensation. Right? Jungian psychology as a sort of contemporary spiritual path, a post-Christian psychology, a post-Christian cosmology. So the dead are Anabaptists who were Swiss Reformed Protestants. These are Jung's ancestors that he's doing ancestral work with through his Red Book. Right? And through Philemon, the ghost, educates his ancestors to sort of bring them into the 20th century from the 15th century, right? To sort of update them and bring them into this new dispensation or this new cosmology, right? I think that it's a way that Jung's paternal and maternal lineages combine. I think it's a moment of it, like what Jung would refer to as a reconciling symbol. That's what he would refer to as the self. This is a moment where personalities number 1 and 2 come together. He gets to be both the philosopher, he gets to be both the psychologist and the Gnostic philosopher. He gets to both stand in the ancestry of his father with the Anabaptists, and he also gets to stand in the lineage of his mother doing this work with the dead. And they both come together in this experience that was a haunting. His entire house was filled with ghosts. He's in his kitchen, I think. The atmosphere was thick. I knew that something had to happen. The whole house was filled as if there were a crowd present, crammed full of spirits. These were his ancestors. Right? And it was this flood that broke for him, again, right? And then the dead cry out. They cry out in this chorus, right? The beginning of the 7 sermons is also the beginning of the end of Jung's Red Book experience and the beginning of his emergence back into the world. Right? This was his boon. This was his pearl of great price, these 7 sermons, because that was the mythologized, what would become future of Jungian psychology. Right? So that's sort of the climax of the talk. I'm gonna start to land the plane, looking at some of Jung's later writings. I'm particularly interested in method here. So we see the shift in Jung's perspective from 1920, when he first wrote this essay, Psychological Foundation of Belief in Spirits, and then, as he did with so many of his works, revised them much later in life. So in 1920, we see more of Jung's reductionism. What are the spirits? Well, the spirits are complexes of the collective unconscious. Like, that's very, like, you know, arrogantly sort of categorical. Like, it's almost like a reductionist sort of, well, that's just easy. Yeah, spirits are complexes. Like, later, 28 years later, after collecting psychological experience, this is much more humble. For many people and many countries for over 50 years, I no longer feel as certain as I did when I wrote those words. To put it bluntly, I doubt whether an exclusively psychological approach can do justice to the phenomenon in question. It calls into question his methodology. What does he mean by psychological? Right? We could rephrase this to say, I doubt whether an exclusively psychological materialist approach can do justice to the phenomenon in question. So we need new models. We need new psychologies. That's what it comes down to. Right? And of course, this goes back to the influence of William James. Right? How do we regard these secondary selves? How do we regard these other phenomena in question? Right? This is the more that James refused to reduce. Right? And of course, it brings up what Joe was talking about this morning, the non-locality of consciousness, which is sort of where these conversations are at today, and the influence of quantum theory. Right? And all the research that's been done, particularly at Esalen, by their SIR-SEM group, who used to meet annually, and has published very, very thick volumes on the further reaches of consciousness. Just a little plug for the Philemon Foundation. If you want to throw them a couple bucks, they're trying to publish another early study of Jung and mediumship from 1903. Hasn't been published yet, so they're trying to raise some money to do that. And this is pretty much it. So I want to revisit this model that we looked at earlier about the pathological and non-pathological models of minds. And I want to add one additional voice here, which is the Bay Area psychologist, psychotherapist, Elizabeth Mayer. Some of you might know her work or know her. And she wrote a very influential and interesting essay, crazily, almost 20 years ago now, where she reframes these models as boundaried versus what she calls radically connected models of mind. Right? And what I'm arguing for, if I'm arguing for anything, is that the types of new psychologies that I think many of us are imagining or reimagining follow along this notion of radically connected. So we're moving, and again, I mean, Joe said it better than me this morning, we're moving away from either a one-person model or a two-person model of the psyche, where it's two folks in a room sort of talking to each other, and like there's really good stuff there. I'm not knocking anyone's profession. But there's also this thing, like what William James called the more. There's more that's in the analytic dyad that all of you know. For those of you that are therapists, there's more there than just two. And there's more there than just the analytic third. There are presences. There are beetles that fly in and tap on the window just as the client is presenting a dream about a beetle. I mean, these things happen. These things happen. Right? There is more. We are radically connected, and it goes beyond the therapist, the client, the psyche. It even goes beyond ancestors. It goes into the mycelial. It's an ecological model. I'm just rehashing what we all heard this morning at this point, but he stole my thunder. It's an ecological model. I'm just kidding. He's been doing this work for decades. It's an ecological model that connects both with nature, plants, and trees, as well as the animal world. That's Jung's whole thing about synchronicity and the psychoid, is that it goes out of the self into nature, and it goes out of nature into the self, because ultimately these boundaries are very porous, extraordinarily porous. And indigenous cultures and indigenous psychologies have known this for millennia, and we're just catching up. We're outgrowing our scientific materialism, or our psychological materialism. Right? We are a radically, radically connected and interconnected species, interspecies, trans species. Right? So that is that's it, and we got plenty of time for conversation. And yeah, thanks for being here and paying attention. And, yeah.